coming of the Europeans, sultans, ship captains, and the spice trade. According to the Sejarah Melayu, after Singapore was attacked in the late 14th century, its ruler, Iskandar Shah, fled. He founded a new kingdom at Malacca, and Singapore became the base for Malacca's Laksamana, naval commander. In 1511, Malacca fell to the Portuguese, who were expanding into Southeast Asia because of the lucrative spice trade. This marked the start of the European colonialism in the region. At this time, Singapore was ruled by the Johor Riau Sultanate, which vied with the Portuguese to control the southern entrance to the Singapore and Malacca Straits. Portuguese sources say that there was a Shabandar, a harbor master, based in Singapore in the early 1600s. The Dutch arrived in the region in the 17th century. For the next 2 centuries, they struggled with the Portuguese, the Malays, and the Assanese, and the Bugis to control trade. Singapore witnessed some of these sea battles. In one particularly dramatic encounter in 1603, Portuguese and Dutch ships faced off in the waters off Changi. Your Majesty should become the lord of this port, which is one of the best that serves the East Indies. Your Majesty can build a city there and become lord of this kingdom. Jacques de Cout, petitioning the crowns of Spain and Portugal at the beginning of the 1600s. Here is Malacca at that time. Crown Colony, 1819 to 1941. In 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles and Major William Farquhar arrived in Singapore. They struck a deal with the local Malay rulers to set up a British trading port, which Raffles declared would be open to ships and vessels of every nation, free of duty. This brought in traders and ships from as far away as Arabia and Africa. By the 1850s, Singapore was the center of trade in Southeast Asia. Singapore became a crown colony in 1867, together with the other Straits settlements of Malacca and Penang. As the British Empire flourished, so did Singapore. The population swelled with migrants from the Malay archipelago, China, and South Asia. Some came to trade as before, but many more came to work in Port City and in the plantations and mines of Malaya. Indeed, Malayan rubber and tin powered Singapore's growth into an export and international financial center. On a smaller scale, but not too different in character from what it is now. By the time Singapore celebrated its centenary day in 1919, it was a modern city, hosting of the second largest dry dock in the world, and modern conveniences such as electricity, motor cars, and international telegraph and telephone connections. Founder of modern Singapore. Before he came to Singapore, Sir Stamford Raffles had been with the East India Company in the Malay archipelago for almost 14 years. He led the British invasion of Java in 1811, then served as Lieutenant Governor of Java, 1811 to 16, and Lieutenant Governor of Bengkulu, 1818 to 22. The British believed in free trade, and Raffles wanted to establish another port to control the lucrative China trade. He was also inspired by his studies of Malay history to resurrect the legendary Malay capital, Temasek. With Major William Farquhar, he set off for the Riau Lingga archipelago and selected Singapore for a new port. After signing the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance of 1819 with Sultan Hussein and Temenggung Abdul Rahman, he appointed Farquhar as resident and returned to Bengkulu. Raffles spent a total of only 9 months in Singapore, mostly from 1822 to 1823. He is credited with introducing a town plan, establishing modern laws, and founding the Singapore Institution, now known as Raffles Institution. Emporium, 1819 to 1867. A free port to destroy the spell of Dutch monopoly. The opening of the British free port triggered a dramatic transformation. Singapore's population grew to more than 10,000 within 5 years, and the harbor, from Telok Ayer to the west of Kalang in the east, was filled with ships from the Malay archipelago, Asia, and Europe. They brought cargo such as cloth and opium from India, silk, tea, and ceramics from China, as well as Straits produce such as spices, pearls, bird's nests, and tortoiseshell. The ships also brought laborers from China and British India. They did much of the hard work of clearing the land, transporting cargo, and building the town. By the 1830s, the Chinese were the largest ethnic group in Singapore. In particular, the Taukays, the Chinese merchants, dominated commerce for much of the 19th century. Like their Arab, Armenian, European, and Indian counterparts, they were involved in regional trade, as well as in property, opium, and pepper and gambier plantations. William Farquhar, the first president. A Scottish officer in the East India Company's private army, Major William Farquhar served in India and Malacca and became the resident of Malacca in 1803. After Malacca was handed to the Dutch in 1818, Farquhar began negotiations with the Riau Sultanate. His familiarity with regional politics enabled him and Raffles to secure the Treaty of 1819 in Singapore. Farquhar was appointed the resident of Singapore, and his popularity with the people of Malacca attracted many traders, craftsmen, and laborers here. Within 2 years, Singapore's population had grown to 5,000, and the port had conducted $8 million Spanish dollars worth of trade. However, Farquhar also ignored some of Raffles' town plans and, despite Raffles' objections, permitted gambling and slavery. In 1823, Raffles removed Farquhar as resident. Farquhar returned to England and later challenged, without success, the East India Company to recognize him as the founder of Singapore. John Crawford, making Singapore work. Like his predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel William Farquhar, Dr. John Crawford had been an East India Company official for many years before he became the resident of Singapore in 1823. To finance the settlement while maintaining a free port, Crawford introduced licenses for pawnbroking, gunpowder sales, opium and spirits, and legalized public gambling. He also directed the building of roads and bridges and started the first newspaper, the Singapore Chronicle. Most importantly, after the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824, in which the Dutch recognized the British presence in Singapore, Crawford pressed Sultan Hussein and Temenggong Abdul Rahman to sign a new treaty to cede Singapore in full sovereignty and property to the East India Company, its heirs and predecessors. This effectively made Singapore a British possession and ended Malay control. Crawford's term as resident ended in 1826 after he returned to England. He was politically active and campaigned for Singapore to become a crown colony. Pirate attacks were often carried out by the Orange Loop Sea people in Singapore and the Malay archipelago, as well as by the Irenum from the Sulu archipelago. Both British and the Dutch raided pirate strongholds in an attempt to stop the pirates on their home ground. These cannons were manufactured in the Malay Peninsula and in the archipelago and mounted at the corners of stockades. They were swivel guns that could fire at various angles. Because of their small size, they were also mounted on the rails of Malay boats. Here is a quote from Lieutenant Colonel William Butterworth, Governor of the Straits Settlements, upon presentation of the Sword of Honor, that one, to Temenggong Daing Ibrahim of Johor on 31st August 1846. Happily, for some time past, piracy has been rarely heard of in the vicinity of our own shores. By the powerful aid of His Highness Sri Maharaja, the Tumenggung of Johor, to whom I am directed to present this sword. View of Singapore Harbor, 1850s. This view of the Singapore waterfront is painted in the style of Chinese trade painting, a genre developed by Chinese artists painting treaty port scenes for the European market. Judging from the lack of accuracy of the buildings depicted, the unknown artist probably never set foot in Singapore. However, the scene of shipping vessels in the foreground offers a richly detailed picture of Singapore's bustling port. A British paddle steamer in the center of the picture is flanked by French and American merchant sail ships, amid several Chinese-type junks from Siam. Smaller Malay boats are also depicted, including tongkang or bumboats lining the shore and parahu sailboats further out at sea. Port City, 1867 to the 1900s. Liverpool of the East. In 1867, Singapore became a crown colony, together with Malacca and Penang. Over the next few decades, it grew rapidly into a city with global connections. As steamships became more common, and with the opening of the Suez Canal, Singapore's trade increased eightfold between 1873 and 1913. Singapore also became more embedded in the British Empire. It was linked by telegraph in 1870, which enabled international banking transactions, as well as sped up the exchange of news and information. In 1874, the signing of the Pangkor Treaty with Perak further increased British control over the Malay Peninsula, paving the way for even more trade and investment into Singapore. By the 1900s, Singapore had a population of over 225,000, 2.5 times what it was in 1867. Some people built fortunes, but many more labored under difficult and harsh conditions. Social tensions sometimes flared up, triggering disturbances such as the Chinese post office riots of 1876 and the Veranda or 5-foot way riots of 1888. Rickshaw coolies, door to door on the road. For the thousands of Chinese sojourner migrants, Huang Bat Hang Chao in Mandarin, in Singapore, one job that many able-bodied young men could take up was pulling a rickshaw. The two-wheeled vehicle, which originated from Japan, was a popular mode of public transport from 1880 until the 1930s. Fares were inexpensive, about 6 cents a mile at the turn of the century, and rickshaw pullers covered most of the island, both urban and rural areas. Rickshaw coolies led a hard life, working at least 10 to 12-hour shifts for about 30 to 40 cents a day. They hauled several hundred pounds of weight across the city every day, often at the pace of a smartly stepping horse. Because of the physical toll on their bodies, coolies usually worked for 5 to 7 years before returning to China. The business was at first dominated by the Cantonese and Hokkien, then by the Hokshu and Henghua from 1900. Here is a coolie house sign, early 20th century, painted wood. Reproduction photographs of opium smokers. New immigrant workers from China usually took up temporary residence at lodging houses. Most of these spaces were crowded and grim. The workers stayed there until they found work in Singapore or left to work in the Malayan interior. For many of these working class men, opium smoking was a form of relaxation and escape from their cramped and unpleasant living conditions. However, if they succumbed to addiction and could not pay their rent, they would be turned out by their landlords. Here are some opium pipes and water pipes. The long Chinese opium pipe, unlike the smaller tobacco water pipe, is designed to distill rather than combust opium pellets. These pellets are placed in the pipe and held over a lamp for smoking. As the heated opium vaporizes, a black sooty residue known as dross is deposited on the inside of the pipe head. British-run opium houses in Malaya supplied opium in small lead tubes. They also sold small portions of dross for those who could not afford opium. When smoked, dross is particularly toxic for the liver. Modern times, 1900s to 1941. How Sir Stamford's Child has grown. In the 20th century, Singapore was one of the jewels of the British Empire. The government modernized the port and built the King's Dock, the largest dry dock east of the Suez. The causeway was completed in 1923, connecting Singapore to the Malay Peninsula. The British also built military facilities to protect Singapore, such as the naval base at Sembawang. The booming Malayan tin and rubber industries fueled growth as well. Although Singapore was affected by the Great Depression, the economy recovered within a decade. By the late 1930s, Singapore was a city of over 500,000 people, with modern conveniences such as motor cars, cinemas, and wireless radio. These innovations reconnected Singapore's Asian population with their ancestral homelands, such as China or India. They also learned about anti-colonial political movements in other parts of the world. More Asians began to question their loyalties to the crown or to their homeland and where they belong in an immigrant society like Singapore. The new generation. Professionals, pundits, and political activists. In the late 19th century, more Asians, primarily men, in Singapore became doctors, lawyers, clerks, officials, and businessmen. They were educated in English, dressed in European fashions, and pursued the European high life in clubs, reading rooms, regattas, and parties. By the first half of the 20th century, there was a boom in local and foreign newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets in English and Asian languages. Through these experiences, the educated Asian class was influenced by ideas about nationalism and politics. More people began to explore the meanings of nation, citizenship, and empire. In 1914, the English language newspaper Malaya Tribune was launched as the voice for the domiciled communities of Chinese, Malays, Indians, Europeans, and Eurasians who had been born in Malaya or settled there. Over the years, although some still identified with their ancestral nation based on language or culture, others began to think of Malaya as their home and nation, a multicultural Malaya for Malayans. The Chettiars of Market Street, the world of small business finance. The Chettiars originated from Tamil Nadu in India and were primarily moneylenders across the British Empire in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. In Singapore, their places of business, known as Kitangi Warehouse, Tamil, were near the Singapore River along Chulia and Market Streets. The Chettiars were important to the economy because they obtained credit from the British and offered loans to small businesses. Their clients were mainly Chinese businessmen or civil servants, as well as the Tamil community. The Chettiars lived in close-knit, all-male communities in the Kitangi. They typically spent 3 years in Singapore, then took a sabbatical in India before returning to Singapore to work. Boys as young as 10 came with their fathers or grandfathers to learn the business. The Chettiars also saw the business as part of their religious duty and donated some of their earnings to the Hindu deity Murugan. Here is a quote from Subia Lakshmanan, 4th generation Chettiar. The Chettiar ethic is very much a Protestant ethic. Work hard, live very simply, and earn as much profit as you can. The more profit you make means the more blessings you have from God. He is smiling on you. In accordance with the principle of Mahimai, a share of the profit is shared with God through contributions to religious and charitable work. Rene Onrayet and the Special Branch, keeping an eye on subversives. Englishman Rene Onrayet joined the Straits Settlements Police Force in 1907. He later moved to Singapore, and in 1922 he became the head of the Criminal Intelligence Department, later renamed the Special Branch. The unit was responsible for internal security matters such as the surveillance of political suspects and infiltration of seditious groups. It also monitored racial, religious, and social activities. The Special Branch was especially concerned with Chinese communist subversives who advocated anti-Westernism and anti-imperialism. They knew that the Chinese Communist Party had influence in Singapore's Chinese night schools, labor organizations, and the local Kuomintang. Onrayet also noted that the working class Hainanese community was more susceptible to leftist ideology. The special branch conducted numerous raids and immigration checks to detain or deport suspected revolutionaries, and significantly weakened the influence of the Malayan Communist Party. The Kreta Ayer incident. Revolutionary violence in the streets. On 12 March 1927, at Happy Valley Amusement Park in Kreta Ayer, Chinese organizations held a public commemoration for the second anniversary of the death of Chinese revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen. Some people made speeches even though the police had forbidden it, and members of the Hainanese delegation, which was known to be left-wing and supporters of the Kuomintang, shouted, "Down with imperialism!" Violence broke out, leading to bloodshed, deaths, and the destruction of property in the streets of Chinatown and at the Kreta Ayer police station. Political unrest, further violence, and Chinese dissatisfaction with the colonial government persisted for the next few weeks, and the Straits Times described the People's Park area as a war scene. The incident brought the problem of communist subversion
will be closing in 30 minutes.
to light.
Thank you for visiting the National Museum of Singapore. We look forward to seeing you again.
Years, the police conducted raids
Ladies and gentlemen, our galleries will be closed.
conducted raids on night schools and printers of revolutionary pamphlets, and also deported Hainanese suspects. From the very outset, subversive activities in Malaya were due to outside influences. There was no irritant within Malaya to give rise to such a reaction. This is a quote from Rene Onrayet in his 1946 memoir, Singapore, A Police Background. The Singapore Mutiny, revolt against the Empire. On 15 February 1915, 850 soldiers from the 5th Indian Light Infantry, which was temporarily stationed in Singapore, launched an armed uprising against the British. From their barracks at Alexandra, they spread out to Tanglin, Outram, Keppel Harbour, and Pasir Panjang, sabotaging infrastructure and attacking Europeans. When the violence ended several days later, about 47 officers and civilians, mostly British, had been killed. The mutiny shocked the colonial administration. At the time, Europe was embroiled in World War I. Although a German prisoner of war claimed to have instigated the mutiny, the Indian soldiers testified during the court-martial that they had been influenced by political agitation by Indian Muslims in Singapore and propaganda from the Ghadar Party, a revolutionary anti-imperial movement from northern India. The all-Muslim unit had also been concerned that they would be dispatched to fight in Europe against fellow Muslims from Turkey, which was then allied with Germany. Shonan To, 1942 to 1945. Well before World War II began, the British had developed the Singapore strategy to defend the British Empire in Asia. In Singapore, they built a naval base at Sembawang, strengthened the Air Force, and installed large 15-inch coastal guns. Singapore became known as the Gibraltar of the East, or Fortress Singapore. At the same time, the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 stirred up the Chinese community in Singapore. They formed patriotic organizations which raised funds for China's war effort and organized boycotts of Japanese goods and businesses. On 8th December 1941, Singapore experienced war for the first time when the Japanese bombed the city. On the same day, Japanese troops landed on the northeast coast of Malaya and began their invasion. After a swift 70-day campaign, the Japanese, to almost everyone's surprise, defeated the British and occupied the Malay Peninsula and Singapore. The British surrendered on 15 February 1942. Singapore was placed under military occupation and renamed Shonan To, Light of the South, in Japanese. While the war continued elsewhere, the Singapore population struggled with food and fuel shortages, disease, and at its worst, violence and harassment from the Japanese. The occupation ended only when Japan surrendered to the Allies in 1945. this and then this. Ready? The battle for Malaya. Allied forces on the defensive. The Japanese air raid on Singapore and the landing of Japanese troops in Malaya took the British by surprise. On 8 December 1941, the British warships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales left Singapore to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet. Unfortunately, the ships and their escorts were spotted by the Japanese. Without air cover, they were attacked and easily sunk by Japanese bombers. On land, the Allies had about 120,000 soldiers from British regiments, the Indian Third Corps, and the Australian Imperial Force. However, these soldiers were relatively unprepared and inexperienced, and lacked good command leadership. After a chain of military defeats down the Malay Peninsula, the Allies were forced to withdraw to Singapore by 31st January 1942. In Singapore, local volunteer units such as the Singapore Volunteer Corps and Dal Force were mobilized to support the Allied forces. Meanwhile, Japanese air raids on Singapore intensified, and on the night of 8 February, Japanese soldiers landed in Singapore. This is the Type 95 Ha-Go Japanese tank. The Type 95 Ha-Go was the most common Japanese tank used in World War II. Introduced in 1935, this light tank was equipped with a Mitsubishi diesel engine and armed with a 37mm gun and two 7.7mm machine guns. The fast and highly maneuverable tank could even compete against Allied light tanks in 1941. Over 2,000 such tanks were produced before the war ended. The tank saw action in Malaya and the Pacific War. During the battle in Singapore, these tanks broke the British defense and reached Bukit Timah within a few days of the initial Japanese army landings in northern Singapore. This replica was one of 4 that were constructed for Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg's television miniseries, The Pacific, in 2010. The replica weighs 3.5 tons, and the tank's track was based on an original in the collection of the Australian War Memorial.